Okay, so you all should be able to see my screen and the presentation. So welcome everyone to the Chronically Homeless Definition and Document Requirements Training. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start by introducing the compliance and coordinated entry teams. Sorry, what was that? We good? Okay. So I will start off. My name is Tia Alexander. I'm the Coordinated Access Manager here at Strategies. Danny, go ahead.
You all can make sure you're muted. Hi, my name is Danny. I'm with Coordinated Entry at Strategies.
And Amanda, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, Amanda Maybor, Coordinated Access Specialist with Strategies.
Okay, and then I'm going to introduce Jamie Hummer, the program director. She's probably in this training, but she is driving. So there's also Jamie Hummer, our program director here at Strategies. And then I'm going to pass it over to compliance. Suzanne, do you want to introduce yourself? Okay, Ebony.
Good afternoon. I'm Ebony Farrell, and I'm a compliance coordinator here with Strategies.
So we anticipate the presentation taking about 45 minutes with time for questions at the end. But if something comes up during the presentation, feel free to ask questions at any time. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ebony, who's going to start us off. Hold on, Ebony, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, so today we're going to briefly review HUD's chronic homeless definition, along with HUD's documentation requirements and why they are important. We'll also discuss how participants' eligibility with regards to their chronic homelessness status is documented in our CLC. We've seen in monitoring visits that many agencies are unclear about what documentation they need to satisfy HUD's requirements. And we want to make sure that everyone is clear, since chronic homelessness documentation is documentation that the participant is eligible for the program. So we'll start off with why HUD created the definition of chronic homelessness. They recognized that there was a population of hard-to-serve people who were spending long periods of time living in shelters or places not fit for human habitation. Defining who fits into this group helps to ensure that those with the longest history of homelessness and the most severe needs are able to be prioritized for housing resources. Every year, HUD puts out a Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, which announces the next round of CLC funding that can be applied for, and further specifies the rules that govern the use of that funding. HUD also clarifies regulations through notices. The term chronically homeless was first introduced in fiscal year 2002 CLC NOFA and has been expanded and clarified through some subsequent NOFAs and notices and the final rule. They're all listed on this slide in case you would like to look them up. You've seen this definition before, but it is helpful to review it. A person is chronically homeless if they, number one, have a qualifying disability, two, live in a place not fit for human habitation, safe haven, emergency shelter, three, have either lived in all of these places continuously for at least 12 months, or for a total of at least 12 months on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years. And number 4, if the months are continuous, it must be the current episode of homelessness. And number 5, HUD considers a break in homelessness to be at least 7 nights. So if someone is staying in the shelter for 2 months, left to stay with a friend for 3 nights, and then return to the shelter for 2 more months, that would count as 4 continuous months. But if they stayed at their friend's house for 7 nights before returning to the shelter, it would count as 4 months, but 2 separate occasions. A stay of fewer than 90 days in an institution, such as a jail or an inpatient mental health facility, does not constitute a break, and the period of time spent in an institution counts towards the total amount of time homeless if less than 90 days and immediately preceded by actual homelessness, as I just described. So if someone is living on the streets for 2 months, then incarcerated for 2 months, their length of time homeless upon release from jail would be 4 months. Participants do not, however, retain their chronically homeless status if they enter transitional housing. Although persons in transitional housing are considered homeless for the annual point in time count that we report to HUD, they do not meet the criteria in HUD's chronic homeless definition, which is emergency shelter, safe haven, place not meant for habitation, or an institution where they have been for fewer than 90 days, which was immediately preceded by actual homelessness. Any stay of 7 nights or more in transitional housing would constitute a break and does not count towards a person's length of time homeless for the purpose of establishing chronicity. If a person is exiting an institution after residing there for fewer than 90 days and they meet the definition on the previous slide prior to entering, they still meet the definition of chronically homeless upon exit from the institution if they're exiting to homelessness. If an adult head of household meets all of the criteria on either of the 2 previous slides, the household as a whole qualifies as chronically homeless. If there are no adults in the household, a minor head of household can also qualify as chronically homeless. It is not necessary for the other members of the household to have been with the qualifying head of household throughout the duration of their homelessness. Although most of this presentation is focused on the first part of the chronic homelessness definition, which is time spent in an emergency shelter, place not meant for human habitation, or safe haven, a person must also have a qualifying disability in order to meet the definition of chronic homelessness. Qualifying disability for the purpose of chronic homelessness is the same as for general supportive housing, permanent supportive housing eligibility. Moving on to chronic homelessness documentation, HUD requires all agencies to have written policies and procedures to ensure that programs are operating in compliance with COC regulations. In addition to this general requirement, HUD specifies certain details that must be addressed in your policies and procedures. One such detail is that your written policies and procedures must require documentation at intake of the evidence relied upon to verify chronically homeless status. This may mean printing or creating a PDF of an HMIS report or obtaining other documentation from a referring shelter or street outreach program. Another specific detail that must be included in your written policies and procedures is establishment of the priority for obtaining evidence of chronic homelessness. First priority is third-party documentation. This can be an HMIS record, which we'll discuss in more detail later, or a written observation by a third party, such as an outreach worker. It is not necessary that the person be a homeless service provider. For example, it could be a police officer or business owner who has personally observed the participant's sleeping situation. If you are using third-party documentation other than an HMIS record, please upload in the client's BI SPDAT file where the coordinated entry staff will review. A single documented encounter in a month is enough to count the whole month, unless there is evidence of a break of 7 days or 7 nights or more. The second best form of documentation would be intake worker certification. There's been some confusion in the past about who is an intake worker. In this context, the person completing the participant's intake into the housing program is the intake worker. Other workers, such as GCB street outreach workers, are third party. Only if all reasonable efforts have been made to obtain third-party documentation and have been unsuccessful is intake worker observation acceptable as the next best form of documentation. This is really only possible to verify the participant's homeless status at intake and would mean that you would go physically to see where the person is sleeping and certify that you saw them sleeping under a bridge or whatever their actual sleeping location is on any given date. An intake worker writing down the participant's report for their sleeping situation is not sufficient. Clearly, you cannot observe what has happened in the past, so intake worker certification cannot be used to document where the participant has slept in past months. Intake worker certification must be accompanied by a written account of what efforts have been made to obtain third-party documentation and must also be accompanied by a self-certification signed by the participant that corroborates the intake worker's observation. If third-party documentation and intake worker observation are not possible to obtain, the participant can sign a self-declaration detailing the specific location and dates to the best of their recollection in each sleeping location. When obtaining self-certification to supplement other documentation for a participant whose chronic homelessness status is based on 4 instances adding up to 12 months, make sure that there are still 4 instances after self-certification. Sometimes participants self-certify for the months in between HMIS documented episodes, reducing the number of instances. In those cases, you should work with the participant to identify any breaks that would make it at least 4 separate instances, and if that is not possible, contact coordinated entry. Up to 3 months of homelessness can be documented through self-certification for all participants. If at least 9 months of homelessness, cumulative or continuous, cannot be obtained by third-party documentation, up to the full 12 months can be documented via self-certification only. This is limited to rare and extreme cases, and no more than 25% of households served by the project in the project's operating year. In order to determine that a participant has been homeless for a continuous 12-month period or 4 separate instances in a 3-year period, you need to look at breaks of 7 nights or more. Breaks can be documented by third-party documentation, but this is not required. All breaks can be documented by self-certification. Documenting a stay of fewer than 90 days in an institution follows the same priority of documentation as time spent in a place not meant for human habitation, emergency shelter, or safe haven. Third-party documentation, such as discharge paperwork, is preferred, but stays in institutions can be documented by self-certification by the participant. As I mentioned before, the documentation for a qualifying disability for the purpose of establishing chronic homelessness status is the same as required for permanent supportive housing eligibility. Acceptable documentation includes a written verification from a professional licensed by the state to diagnose and treat the disability that certifies that the disability is expected to be long-term or of indefinite duration. It substantially impedes their ability to live independently, and it could be improved by housing. The guidance that I have received is that an MSW alone is not licensure to diagnose and treat a disability, and that in the state of Ohio, a LSW still needs supervision from an LISWS. Another acceptable form of documentation is a Social Security letter that confirms that the person's disability-related benefits, There must be something on the letter that indicates that these benefits are SSI or SSDI, since the Social Security Administration also deals with survivors' benefits and other benefits that would not be proof of a disability. And then another form of acceptable documentation would be a receipt of a disability check, and that is acceptable as a form of disability documentation. If you do not have one of the above forms of documentation at intake, the regulations do allow intake workers to record their observation of a disability as temporary disability documentation. However, acceptable documentation does need to be obtained and placed in the participant record within 45 days of intake. Personally, I would not recommend using this flexibility unless you are absolutely certain that the proper documentation can be obtained. So now that we've covered the chronic homelessness definition and HUD's documentation requirements, let's now look at how things work in our CLC. Since the final rule was published in 2016, all permanent supportive housing projects have chronically homeless dedicated beds, meaning that coordinated entry prioritizes chronically homeless individuals and households for available permanent supportive housing units. Every time we apply for a CLC PSH project, we select in the project application that the project commits 100% of its beds to chronically homeless households. This doesn't mean that beds should be held open if there are no eligible households that meet the criteria of chronic homelessness. A non-chronically homeless household may be placed in a chronically homeless dedicated bed if coordinated entry certifies that there was no eligible household that met the criteria of chronic homelessness at the time of match. Additionally, a quick note about rapid rehousing projects. Our rapid rehousing projects prioritize households experiencing documented long-term homelessness with a qualifying disability per our community prioritization policies. The policy describes the criteria for chronic homelessness, but without the higher standards of documenting it, this allows for people to be prioritized for rapid rehousing with self-certified disability, allowing for quick enrollment for rapid rehousing clients. So now I'll pass it over to Danny to talk about how outreach and shelter staff document eligibility for coordinated entry matches. Danny, I think you're muted.
Okay, this is an overview of the next two sections. These are the essential elements of documenting eligibility in terms of chronically homelessness status in our CLC and who is ultimately responsible for each item. The chronically homeless assessment, that would be the outreach or shelter staff. Verification or obtaining of documentation, that would be the housing provider. The coordinated entry referral, that would be the housing provider. Maintaining the chronically homeless documentation tracker, that would be the housing provider.
Danny, you're muted again.
I wonder why it keeps muting me. Okay. In our CLC, only clients who are document ready are able to be prioritized as chronically homeless for a match, for reasons the compliance team will go over later in this presentation. Clients who are chronically homeless but do not have the necessary third-party documentation may be able to be matched to a PSH provider in rare cases. Coordinated entry staff will notify a case manager if this is able to be done. For shelter and outreach staff, identifying chronically homeless clients begins at intake. The verification of time report, along with the numbers of time homeless and the total number of months homeless, information on the enrollment screen should be reviewed. If the client reports more time homeless at intake than the verification of time report is showing, this could be an indication of self-certed time. If clients have at least 9 months of third-party documentation, providers are encouraged to investigate further to identify possible other third-party or self-certed time homeless. Providers should also review disabling condition information at intake, and again when completing the VI-SPID Act. Just a reminder that a qualifying disability for the purpose of chronic homelessness is the same as for general PSH eligibility, meaning that the documentation such as current SSDI award is acceptable documentation to verify clients are chronic. Documentation of specific disabling diagnoses are only required when a client has been matched to a program that has specific clinical requirements. Some participants may have all of their months and episodes of homelessness documented in HMIS. In Clarity, a participant's homeless history is found in the CIN-01 verification of homeless report. This is the same report that you use to document that the participant was homeless at intake and move-in. To run this report, start in the participant's profile screen, click the printer icon. You will get a list of the client level reports. Click Run next to the CIN-01 verification of homeless report. Fill in the date range, select PDF as the format, and click Submit. When it is ready, you will get a pop-up notification, and you can access it by clicking on that notification or the report queue icon. The report has 2 pages. The first, with the X's, is what you will use to document a participant's time spent as a paragraph 1 homeless. The second page, with the dates, is the one you can use to document that the person was homeless at intake and move-in. The second page may also be needed to verify homeless time and breaks when they happen in the same month. On this report, documented street or outreach and documented break are third-party documentation. Printing or PDF in this report satisfies HUD's requirement for third-party documentation if there are sufficient months and instances. Self-reported street or shelter or self-reported potential break mean that they were reported by the participant at intake. This does not take place of self-certification signed by the participant. You need to get the participant to sign one if it does not come over from the referring agency for any month that is to be counted. If the participant qualifies as chronically homeless because of one continuous period of at least 12 months of homelessness and there is an X in the self-reported or potential break column, you should look for any documentation in the participant's record and ask the participant if they were staying somewhere other than a shelter, safe haven, or place not meant for human habitation for at least 7 nights. If there is no evidence of a break, you don't need to ask the participant about it. In other words, you should do your due diligence to investigate clear indications that the participant was not homeless for 12 continuous months, but do not search for disqualifications where there is no indication that they exist. If the participant qualifies as chronically homeless because of 4 instances in the past 3 years, adding up to at least 12 months, and there are not 3 breaks documented in HMIS, you will work with the participant to identify the document and document when the breaks occurred. Note, if there is a documented break on the report, that means the client has enrolled in a permanent housing program during that time.
Hold on just a second, Danny. Go ahead, Danny. Britt, you had a question?
So just to be clear, to chronic somebody, they are only allowed to self-cert for 3 months, correct? And then third-party certification, how many months is that?
There's no limit for third party.
Okay.
Any other questions? Once the provider has identified a client as chronically homeless, the necessary documentation is collected, and you will complete the chronically homeless assessment in Clarity. The chronically homeless assessment is a tool developed to efficiently expedite the process of housing the most vulnerable individuals. It's used by coordinated entry to identify and prioritize chronically homeless households. To access the chronically homeless assessment, first, be sure you are logged into the Strategies Coordinated Access Agency. Search for your client. Then from the client profile, click on the Programs tab. Then click the edit icon next to the COC via SPDAT project enrollment. Click on the Assessments tab, then click the Start button next to the Chronically Homeless Assessment. Assessment date, the date the assessment was completed. This field is auto-completed. Next is the disability verification on file question. Answer yes if the client has disability verification in the provider's file that is ready to be provided to a housing provider if and when a client is matched. If the answer is no, coordinated entry will not be able to verify the client's chronicity. Exit out and complete the assessment if or when you have the disability documentation on file. Please do not upload disability verification to the Files tab of the VIASPDAT project, as this is a widely shared project. After answering for, sorry, I thought someone was going to say something. Okay. After answering for a disabling condition, now you'll answer questions for third-party documentation and self-certed documentation. For third-party documentation, first, choose how many months are documented in Clarity, found on the verification of homeless report we just looked at. Count the number of months in the documented street and shelter and choose the number from the drop-down. Then, choose how many months of other third-party documentation exists, such as documented from an emergency shelter outside of Hamilton County. Choose yes if you have uploaded the supporting documentation to the Files tab in the VIASPDAT program. If the client has third-party documentation other than Clarity, that documentation must also be uploaded to the Files tab. If additional third-party documentation is not uploaded, coordinated entry will not be able to verify the client's chronicity. Provide details about each episode of homelessness documented by the third party. These dates should add up and equal the months chosen in the previous two questions. If the client does not have other third-party documentation outside of Clarity, choose the appropriate option. Client doesn't know, client refused, or data not collected. Then choose no for the Files question. Next, you'll answer questions for self-certed documentation. If all 12 months have third-party documentation, or if the client does not have self-certed documentation, leave the answer as no and move on to the next question. If there is not 12 months, go ahead. Okay. If there is not 12 months of third-party documentation and the client has self-certification documentation, choose yes. 3 dependent fields will pop up to complete. Choose the number of months of self-cert documentation available. Choose yes if you have uploaded the self-cert documentation to the Files tab in the VIASPDAT program. Finally, list out the months documented by self-cert. These dates should be the same number of months chosen for self-cert documentation available. Once you've documented third-party and self-cert, now you'll answer if the client's documented time is consecutive or includes breaks. Remember, there are 2 ways to document time homeless for chronicity. Either the past 12 consecutive months or at least 12 months over the past 3 years with at least 4 separate instances. Choose yes if the client has been homeless for the past 12 months consecutively, and there is supporting documentation to show that time. Choose no if the client has not been homeless for the past 12 months consecutively, but they have been homeless for at least 12 months over the past 3 years with at least 4 separate instances, and there is supporting documentation. List dates of any breaks in homelessness, then choose yes if supporting documentation is uploaded. Here are two examples of self-cert documentation. Please note the forms state that it is self-declaration document. The months and the years are included. The document is signed and dated by both the client and the provider. On the second example, the time documented is March to May. So the total months documented on this form is 3. Please note this specific form is not required, but is highly recommended to ensure self-cert is documented appropriately. The final two items are the second and third priorities on the PSH prioritization policy. These situations are not technically considered chronically homeless. However, being related to the chronic homelessness, this is where we capture the information for prioritization. Toggle on if either of these statements are true. If the household has been residing in a literal homeless location, wait, my slide moved. If the household has been residing in a literal homeless location for at least 12 months in the last 3 years, but have fewer than 4 instances and more than 1 continuous. Or if the household was enrolled in a permanent housing program within the last year and met criteria for chronic homelessness when enrolled in that program. Hit save and save the assessment. The strategies used only section is the last section of the assessment and is for coordinated entry to document if the client is on the high risk list and if strategies coordinated entry staff have confirmed chronic status for the client. Please do not change anything on this section. The first common issue seen is when no is selected for disability verification on file. The client must have a PSH eligible diagnosis to meet chronically homeless regulations. That documentation should exist in the client file maintained by the agency. Please do not upload disability documentation in the VS for that program. The second commonly seen issue is required documentation is not uploaded. As mentioned on the previous slide, coordinated entry cannot verify time homeless without documentation. If the client has other third-party or self-cert documentation, it must be uploaded. This step is not necessary if all documentation is third-party in Clarity. Time chronic does not meet the definition with the example above. In the first example, 12 months are documented, but there are not 4 instances. In the second example, the client has 12 consecutive months documented. However, they are not the most recent months, which is a requirement. Go back for a minute, Tia. Also, looking at this example, if you were to look at the first example, another issue that we did run into is that the break was counted at the start of August 21, when the break shouldn't have been counted until after the client's first documented stay, which was August 2020, August 2022 or 2022. Does that make sense? You only start counting breaks after their first documented stay. Errors in self-cert documentation. Not signed or dated by the client. Document uploaded is something other than self-cert. The document says third-party verification, or the doc is something completely different, like a pay stub. Months are not documented, but years are not months are documented, but years are not documented. The location is not specific enough. The document is blank and only includes signatures. While on the subject of self-cert, we receive a few questions asking about third-party documentation and the limit or max number of months that can be documented by third party. To clarify, 100% of time documented can be third party. There is no max limit to third-party documentation. The HUD Exchange website has a great quiz available. I'm going to bring it up now and we'll take it together. Please type your answer in the chat. Okay, Ray has been in a shelter for 10 months and then leaves the shelter. But Ray continues to meet with an outreach worker at least once a month for the next 2 months while he's sleeping under a bridge. Does that equal a continuous year of chronic homelessness?
Yes.
Yes is correct. An HMIS record or written referral from the emergency shelter may be used to provide documentation for the 10 months Ray stayed in the emergency shelter, and a written referral from the outreach worker to document the 2 months Ray slept under the bridge serves as third-party documentation for 12 months of homelessness. All right, let's move on to 2. It is required to document all the days of at least 12 months of continuous or cumulative homelessness. So 4 homeless episodes in the last 3 years. So is it required to document? I see yeses and nos. Oh, this is fun. I like this. No is the correct answer. A single encounter per month is sufficient to document the entire month, unless there is clear evidence of a break. For documenting purposes, third-party documentation is preferred, but up to 3 months of a program participant qualifying homelessness can be documented via self-certification. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll change my answer. In addition, if there is clear evidence of a break and it occurs in the same month as documented episode of homelessness, documentation of that break should be uploaded.
Hold on just a second. It gets laggy when I try to switch to the next slide. So just give it 1 minute. There she goes. Okay.
Okay. Now that we've reviewed the chronically homeless assessment, we'll move on to the coordinated entry referral. When the coordinated entry refers a chronically homeless participant to a program, the referral email describes what documentation has been used to identify the participant's chronically homeless status. This information is included to assist the housing program in knowing where to look to obtain documentation of chronicity. The housing program is responsible for ensuring that this documentation is correct and present in the participant's record. The referral email alone does not meet chronically homeless documentation requirements. If there are no eligible chronically homeless participants available for the referral, the coordinated entry referral email used to contain a I always mess this up. Certification of non-chronically homeless placement attachment that was retained in the participant's record as documentation of the participant's eligibility. While you see the separate certification in the participant's record with older intakes, coordinated entry now includes that information in the email itself. So there isn't a separate attachment. To be clear, all PSH records must either have sufficient documentation of chronically homeless or coordinated entry email stating that the participant was not referred as chronically homeless. If neither is present, the participant is not eligible for the program. Now I'll turn it over to Ebony to talk about how to document a client's chronic homelessness in Clarity.
Okay, thank you, Danny. So once the housing provider receives the match, these
Hold
are the
on just a second, Ebony. 1 second.
Oh, okay,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Alex. Did you have a question?
I did. I wasn't fully paying attention, so I was just clarifying. It's also on the outreach worker to keep a copy of the referral too, right? And the chronic documentation, or is it just for on the PSH provider? Did that question make sense or no?
Yeah. I don't understand what he's asking.
Yeah, so there is a requirement for the housing provider to maintain a copy of the match email for their records. Ebony, on compliances, and there is not a requirement for the shelter or outreach provider to maintain a copy of the match email.
No.
Yeah,
Okay,
Alex, so it's not
thank you for that
required, but it's
clarification.
probably good practice.
Gotcha. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I will go ahead and pick back up where Danny left off. So once the housing provider receives the match, these are the essential elements of documenting eligibility in terms of chronic homelessness status in our COC. As with any participant, retain the coordinated entry referral email in the participant record. Verify or obtain adequate documentation of chronicity. You'll need to run the CIN 01 report following the steps that Danny outlined in the last section. If the report does not document sufficient months or episodes of homelessness, the housing program must obtain and piece together the missing documentation to confirm eligibility. Check the Strategies Coordinated Access file in the VI SPDAT project in Clarity and download any additional documentation that has been uploaded there. Look at all the documentation together carefully to see whether it is adequate. If there are still not enough months or instances documented, a tip to obtain additional documentation. This may mean following up with the street outreach worker or third party, or having the participant sign a self-certification for the undocumented months that they were homeless. Refer to the match email for more guidance of what months have been reported previously, but remember that the match email does not count as documentation of any months. Once you have verified that the adequate documentation of chronicity in the participant record is present, update the chronic homelessness documentation tracker. If a participant is referred as chronically homeless, but review of their documentation indicates that they were not in fact chronically homeless, you must contact coordinated entry for guidance. Per the HUD regulations, a project must not have more than 25% of chronically homeless participants whose chronic homelessness status relies on self-certification for more than 3 of their 12 months. There is no limit to the number of breaks that can be documented by self-certification. 100% of all breaks can be self-certified. So this is a visual representation of what that means. For each project, 100% of chronically homeless households served can self-certify for up to 3 of their 12 months. 75% of chronically homeless households served need third-party documentation for 9 of their 12 months. 25% of chronically homeless households served can use self-certification as documentation for all and any months. 100% of breaks can be documented by self-certification. In order to document compliance with this regulation, limiting the percentage of chronically homeless participants relying on self-certification for more than 3 months, all permanent supportive housing projects must maintain a chronic homelessness documentation tracker using the template that Strategies has provided. The requirement to maintain a tracker is not new, but there has been some misunderstanding in the past about the importance of maintaining it and exactly what information should be included. You must maintain a separate tracker for each project. This should be a snapshot of all of the participants you have served or are serving in the current operating year who were referred as chronically homeless. It must clearly identify the operating year for which the CAP is being measured and should be kept up to date at all times. So every time you receive a new chronic homelessness referral, they should be added. At the beginning of the operating year, you need to remove any participants who have exited. You must save the previous year's tracker to satisfy record retention requirements. Whether you maintain different versions as separate tabs in one file or as separate files is up to you. The tracker must identify the project name and the operating year. It must list all participants served during that operating year who were referred as chronically homeless, and it must not include any participants who were not referred as chronically homeless. For each participant who was referred as chronically homeless, the tracker must accurately reflect the number of months documented by each type of documentation present in the participant record, not in the coordinated entry email. Third-party months documented is where you would enter the number of months in HMIS, plus any additional months documented by a different third-party source. Worker months would be the rare instance where the intake worker actually observed the place where the participant was sleeping and documented it, along with obtaining self-certification from the participant. Self-certification months should be months that you have a signed declaration from the participant. As a reminder, an X in the self-reported column on the HMIS report does not count as documentation of any kind. As you can see, only one participant in this project is relying on self-certification for more than 3 months. So this is the only participant who counts against the 25% cap. Even though Lyme has 4 months of self-certification, this does not count against the cap because only 2 of those months were needed to add up to 12 months, as they already have 10 months of third-party documented. This project is compliant with HUD's cap. If your project exceeds the 25% cap, you should contact coordinated entry prior to completing the intake of the participant that put the project over the 25% cap. We have added an exit date column to the tracker to make it easier. Excuse me, I lost my place. We have added an exit date column to the tracker to make it easier for you to see at a glance who should be removed at the beginning of the next operating year. It's helpful to coordinated entry to know if you have a space on your grant for a chronically homeless participant that has less than 9 months of third-party documentation. Coordinated entry can then possibly send a referral that would otherwise not be able to be sent, but is still chronic. If any questions or issues arise in the future, please reach out to us. If your question relates to coordinated entry and a specific participant's eligibility, that question would be best directed to Jamie Hummer or Tia Alexander. If you have questions relating to documentation or compliance, you can contact me or Suzanne Brownchurch. If you are unsure who the appropriate person is, please feel free to email all of us and we'll sort it out on our end. So there you have it. That's the definition and what is required. We realize that this can get a bit complicated when you get into the documentation requirements. However, it is very important that we get this right as it is an eligibility requirement for permanent supportive housing. Are there any questions?
Yes. I just want to confirm a few things. So just to confirm, the third party verification is unlimited. And I believe in the beginning, I heard you say don't upload investor. Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, so when you're uploading the documents, do not upload specific disabling condition documents in the VI SPDAT program because that program can be accessed by other providers. But you do want to upload that additional third-party documentation or self-certification documentation, whether it's for time homeless or if you're documenting breaks into the VI SPDAT files.
Perfect. Got it. Thank you so much for the clarification.
Go ahead, Christy.
I have a question as far from a shelter perspective. So say that we have someone come in and we're doing an intake and they're saying that they have been living in their car for the past 3 months and this is their first time touching an agency. Are we as a shelter having them complete a self-cert for those past 3 months that they're just reporting and uploading? Or like when is the self-cert being completed?
So the self-cert should be completed once you've pulled that verification of time homeless report and they need an additional 3 months. So if this is the first, if the client has never touched the system, this is the first time they've been homeless, the first time they're enrolled in the system, and they say, yep, I was homeless for 3 months, you would just document that in the enrollment because you wouldn't be doing the chronic assessment at that time. So you would only need to document that self-cert documentation or other third-party documentation when you've identified that the client has a qualifying disability, they have the time homeless, you've completed the chronic homeless assessment, then you upload your supporting documentation if it exists.
Okay, and I think that answers my next question then. So the chronically homeless assessment, we're only completing that if we think that they're at that 12-month mark, or we know that they're at that 12-month mark. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
Can you all hear me? Christy, the other time you would complete the chronic homeless assessment in Clarity though is if they meet one of the other 2 categories that Danny went over. It's like the 2 toggles. So if you think somebody has 12 months of homelessness, but they don't meet the chronic definition because of their homeless time, like maybe it was only 2 instances or something like that, but they still have 12 months, you would complete the assessment in that case. And the other one is when somebody has, within the last year, lost permanent housing and was chronic prior to that, the living situation, and are now homeless again. That's the other scenario where you would complete the chronic assessment to let us know that they fall into that category.
Thank you, Jamie.
I have one more quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and I believe my agency, we have the chronic homeless like documentation far as like 101 and how to do it and like basically what you all just went over today. But I'm not for sure if it's up to date information. Is it possible you have a PowerPoint of this you can share and or like documentation of specific?
Not sure I understand the question.
I just basically
Everyone, you're going to get this PowerPoint after this training. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
A copy of this
Yes.
PowerPoint? Yeah.
Yes. Because I screenshot a lot of
Sending that
important things. So that's wonderful. Perfect. Yes. I'm
And
so
of course,
sorry.
if you ever have any questions,
It came off complicated.
I was thinking a little bit too hard about that question, but
I
yes,
think I
we will
was
be
too.
sending the PowerPoint and a copy of any questions asked during this training following the training.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
We will also include a PDF of the self-cert documentation example that we showed in case you all don't have that document available. But once again, you're not required to use that document if your agency has another document that you can use for that self-cert. It's just an example of a really good document.
Thank you.
Alex
Thank
has
you,
had a
Tina.
question in the chat for a few minutes now. I just want to make sure we get to him.
Mhm. Yeah, Alex. So how is it determined and what process would it be for clients that are relying on more than 3 months of self-certification? So in those situations, Alex, you should go ahead and complete the chronically homeless assessment. But like Ebony reviewed on one of those last slides, it's going to be dependent on the housing program to inform coordinated entry that they're not at their 25% cap. So it would, for the outreach or shelter, you would still do the chronically homeless assessment, but know that we can only match those clients if an agency has notified coordinated entry that they're not at their cap yet.
Gotcha. So that's making more sense. So thank you. I guess my last question about that, and I guess this is more continuum specific. Does that happen often? I mean, do we see in our community that agencies are almost always at that cap, or does it kind of fluctuate with time? Or is that something we're not really sure of right now? That's okay. I was just kind of curious.
I've never seen us like have a client like come through that has self-certed more than 3 months. Yeah, or I guess Jamie, I don't know if you remember like when Jennifer Steigerwald was here, if you guys came across people that used more than 3.
You know,
I bet it's very rare.
Way back when, before we made the new policy, it's not even new anymore. We had it, for many years now, but we did match people before that had more than 9 months. But we haven't since we've made that policy, where we're only matching people with 9 months or more of third party. No agency that I know of has told us that they're under their cap, and we are talking about ways to better track that so that we can possibly serve people that have more than or less than 9 months. But it hasn't happened yet.
Gotcha. Well, thanks for that clarification.
So PSH agencies that are on this call, if you are not at your 25% max and you can accept clients who have more than 3 months of self-cert, definitely send that information to coordinated entry. Go ahead, Tara.
Hey, I just want to reiterate, and probably just repeating what's on the PowerPoint, but the whole not putting the disability verification up on Clarity VS, but I guess it's not a formal manual. That was what I was told when I started. So I just wanted to clarify if like that changed or any other preferences for how that's managed.
I don't believe it's changed recently. I think that's how it's always been because of the sharing and the nature of disabling documentation. However, I will say keep an eye out for information from HMIS as we move into that shared open system, because that might change. If any documentation information does change, we'll make sure to send out and inform the community that that's changed. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that perspective, because I started making the team get sign releases for strategies before we put them up there. So it makes sense. We have the same thought process, but now I'm like, oh, where am I storing this to make sure everyone can access it if they need it?
Now it can still be uploaded in the client's files in your project, because that's more locked down, and providers are encouraged to upload that type of documentation to HMIS because it's just easier to hand off to the housing program if it's already uploaded in HMIS. But if you keep files offline in secure locations, it's also okay to have that documentation collected there as well.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Danny.
So going back to what Tara said, so the disability verification form should not be uploaded in the VSPDAT area. It should be uploaded over in our program.
Correct. If
then-
you upload it into HMIS, upload it into your specific agency's program files, not the VI SPDAT files.
Okay, so then we would hand that off to the housing program wherever they got matched to.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, again, that is not other third-party documentation or self-cert documentation. We do want that uploaded in the VI SPDAT files.
Thank you so much for clarifying that, because I was just a little confused there. I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been uploading the homeless documentation in Vesta under case management. So I appreciate the clarify
We could
that.
probably clarify that on our end too, maybe in HMIS, like, I don't know, further, like we could, like if there's like a message that could pop up for people, like when they wave their cursor over in the assessment. But yeah, it is confusing at probably on your end when you're reading that, like, is it uploaded or on file? You're probably like, oh yeah, I'm gonna upload it, but yeah, it's just for
And
privacy reasons.
And just to confirm, never upload specific disabling conditions.
Not to the VI SPDAT files, correct.
Not to the VS for that files. And I'm sorry, specific means, can you be more specific on specific?
Yeah, so there's been some confusion with what type of disabling documentation is acceptable. So I think some providers think that they need a DAF or some other like pretty intense documentation of a disabling condition for the client to be verified as chronic. But that's not the case. Like Ebony said and the PowerPoint said that you can use like SSDI payment verification. But if that client gets matched to a housing program that requires a specific disabling documentation, I'm probably going to say the same one, but say Tender Mercies, you have to have a mental health disability. That's where you do need verification of that specific disabling condition.
Okay. But never something like 26 medical statements, record of conditions, basically. Never upload
if that's
something
the
like
documentation you have, then that documentation can be used, but that specific and numerous documentation isn't required for chronic verification, but it can be used for chronic verification.
Okay, perfect. I totally understand now. Thank you.
We just don't want providers thinking they have to get more specific documentation than they actually need, and like not completing the homeless assessment because you're trying to get this very specific documentation that's not needed to verify chronicity.
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead, Amanda. I think I cut you off. Sorry.
No, you said exactly what I was going to say.
Any other questions about anything chronic related? Housing programs, outreach, shelter, anything that might be on you all's minds? Okay. So just in case I forget, because it happens, I'm going to stop recording.